is going on. Kids locked up in cages, innocence is gone. Serving 20 years for brown skin and a bond. Don't you think something's wrong? The American dream, oh, what does it mean? Is it just me who can tell? Are we supposed to be proud and just not too loud while we're all living in hell? No, I don't feel as free as you say I am. Pretty soon we'll all be damn chasing after something make believe. The American dream is not what it seems. It's not what it seems. It's not what it seems. It's not what it seems.
And so, when I thought of this term, white fragility, the fragility part, we're fragile in that we can barely tolerate the slightest challenge, right? I mean, I'll show you my emails. Just the suggestion that being white has meaning will set us off. But there's a continuum. And so we're fragile in that way, but it's not fragile at all in its impact. It's really effective, right? I need you to stop. I need to get back into my position and my entitlement and my comfort, and I will do what I need to do to get you to stop. And I think that white fragility functions as a kind of white racial bullying. We make it so miserable for people of color to talk to us about their experiences, to call us in, that most of the time they don't because it's not worth getting punished more. You know, trust me, they take home so much of it because it so rarely goes well. Right? And I'm just ask a rhetorical question of people of color in the room. How often have you tried to talk to white people about our inevitable and often racist behaviors, and how'd that go well for you? Okay, I mean, literally, like not even once, right? And so it's weaponized defensive,ness. It's weaponized hurt feelings. It's weaponized denial and obliviousness. And so I'm not the 1%. I've never even been a manager. But I can control the people of color in my orbit through white fragility, right? And so I also think of it as a form of everyday white racial control. You can be in my orbit, and I'll use you as diversity cover, as long as you keep me comfortable. But if you challenge me, you're going to become a personal problem, and you're going to be ejected. And boy, do we see this in the workplace. We want you on the committee. We're not going to pay you anymore, but we do want you on the committee as long as you don't actually do what we asked you to be on the committee to do, right?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. I'm Senior Advisor for Community Engagement at New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and we welcome you to this evening's panel. This is part of the PSEG True Diversity Film Series, and this evening we're going to be discussing White Fragility, highlighting some points from Robin DiAngelo's film and book. We're going to take a deep dive with a dynamic panel on this critical topic. For those of you joining us for the first time, I just wanted to briefly share about NJPAC Social Justice Task Force programming. This was created directly after the murder of George Floyd in an effort to bring our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. NJPAC has launched a series of events and initiatives focused on promoting racial equality and uprooting racism. We invite you to visit our website, our Standing in Solidarity page, which has resources and much more information. And so our goal is that everyone can take action to help to change our community. We're also pleased that we have our advisors, the Newark NAACP chapter and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, that are working with us as well. So now I'd like to welcome Jamar Tyndale. He's Manager of Corporate Responsibility from our corporate sponsor, PSEG, and he will offer remarks. Thank you, Jamar.
Thank you, Donna, and good evening, everybody. My name is Jamar Tyndale, Manager of Corporate Responsibility at PSEG. On behalf of the PSEG Foundation, welcome to this month's edition of the PSEG True Diversity Film Series. We are pleased to support this series where we utilize a featured film to provoke a thoughtful conversation on relevant issues surrounding diversity, inclusion, and equity. At PSEG, diversity and inclusion is one of our core commitments. We have recently reaffirmed this commitment. PSEG and the PSEG Foundation has announced a new Powering Equity and Social Justice initiative that includes a $1 million commitment. We will look forward to sharing more details on this effort in the weeks and months ahead. Tonight's topic, White Fragility, is especially timely. Dr. DiAngelo's work is a riveting platform to build on the soul-searching that is occurring in the wake of George Floyd's tragic death. It's only by first acknowledging blind spots and then eliminating them that our society will be more equitable. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Jamar. Now we're going to have a few words from our social justice program's producer at NJPAC, Katab Rollins.
Good evening. As Donna said, I'm Katab Rollins, and I'm the producer of this event. Tonight's event is called White Fragility, a conversation of allyship. And many of you may have read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo or watched the reading and discussion of her book on YouTube. And while the subject matter covered in her book will give some contextual foundation to tonight's conversation, this panel is not about that book. Our panelists are going to dissect what does it mean to be an ally? What comes with that kind of responsibility? And you'll notice that our esteemed panel is comprised solely of white people, courageous and bold white people. And this assembly was intentional and by design. Black people have been fighting and protesting and leading the charge for racial equality for centuries. Centuries. It's time to hear from white people about their role, or lack thereof, in advancing racial equality. I'll be very clear. Tonight's conversation will be with white people, talking to white people about white people. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Mr. Richard Camerari, who's the Director of Community Engagement at the New Community Corporation and a lifelong Norker and community organizer. Among many other positions, Richard currently serves as an executive committee member of the Newark branch of the NAACP. Richard, take us from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katab. Good evening, everyone. And I want to thank NJPAC, Katab, and Donna for allowing me to moderate tonight. As Katab mentioned, yeah, we got a bunch of white people talking tonight. How about that? And it is about time. I would urge people that you're not going to hear expert testimony tonight. None of us are experts. There's no white person who's an expert on trying to join the struggle or support the struggle for racial justice. We learn as we go, no matter what our ages are. You're going to hear from three people, from their individual experiences, their impulses as to why they do what they do, why are they engaged with racial justice, how they position themselves in that, how they navigate it in terms of dealing with, cross-racial relationships. This will be illustrative, not exhaustive. No one's pretending that you're going to get any kind of conclusions here, but it will be, we think it's going to be a thoughtful conversation that will lay the groundwork for further thought and discussion. So strap in, everyone. So having said that, we will have our panelists do some self-introductions. Toby Stein is with us tonight, and Toby is an author and involved with theater work. So Toby, why don't you go first?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much to the audience for joining tonight. My name is Toby Stein, as Richard mentioned, and I identify as a white cisgender woman. I acknowledge that I'm presently inhabiting the traditional lands of the Lenape Nation, and I honor and recognize the Lenape elders, past, present, and future. I also would like to acknowledge Donna Walker-Kuhn and Tab Rollins for hosting this panel tonight, and PSEG for sponsoring. And I'd like to begin by also acknowledging my African American mentor who guided me through my career path for the first 17 years of my career. He taught me about his experience with racism, and he helped me experience firsthand his community's assets and his own assets within his community, as well as his assets within the white business community. With his wisdom, I realized that I had to examine my own biased attitudes and behaviors and dismantle them in my own life, my own networks, my education, and my workplace. In becoming a white ally, I recognize that the social status, the position of being an ally, is only conferred by BIPOC people with lived experience of oppression in everyday life. In becoming a white ally, I realize I must stand up for racial justice. I must confront my own white fragility, my own denial that I have it, my own defensiveness toward white fragility, my own racist behaviors and attitudes. What does standing up mean? It means using my white privilege to actively dismantle white supremacy, the system of white power, as well as white solidarity, the banding together of white people to keep white power and privilege in place. For white people, it's our obligation to make white solidarity and white supremacy visible so we can interrupt and dismantle it. In speaking to white-led organizations for a book that I wrote on this subject, I asked them to examine their data as it corresponded to national data, which according to scholar Antonio Kyler says that 78% of arts managers are white, and Francie Ostrauer's study said 91% of board members are white. I asked white-led organizations, are you willing to maintain your predominantly white power base? And I heard from some, but we have a minimum give and get. So how can we think about inviting people of color to join our board? I will say to this outrageous answer, as Melody Hobson states in her TED Talk, be color brave. Change your deficit-based criteria. Transform your deficit-based criteria to an asset-based criteria. Connect and build relationships and alliances that you don't have and will benefit from having, from being an inclusive organization. In the education world, we have a cherished privilege called tenure, when you're given the opportunity to teach and to publish for the rest of your life. And if you don't receive this tenure, you have to leave the organization. A committee of your so-called peers determine whether or not you are worthy of this privilege. At an organization in which I was part of for many years, I was asked to join a tenure committee where a person of color's future fate was debated. It was clear that the majority white committee leaned toward not bestowing this privilege and extending it to a person of color. And I spoke up and I said, are you willing to deny tenure to a colleague of color because she hasn't published enough? Be willing to see what she does bring to the organization so that she has opportunities to publish and you make those opportunities happen for her. she was unanimously given tenure. As white allies, we must acknowledge the inequities that our employment structures have and perpetuate, and be willing to be accomplices to stand up and dismantle them. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Toby is on fire tonight here. Next, we have Becca Zimmerman. Becca is a student at PSEG College out in California, but she was very involved with student activism at Newark Academy in terms of racial justice movement there recently, very recently. So Becca, why don't you tell us more about your what you're doing and your introduction.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Becca Zimmerman. As Richard mentioned, I am a senior at PSEG College, and I was invited to this panel because the organizers saw a change.org petition that I had worked on with some peers from my former high school, Newark Academy. The petition basically is asking the school to grapple with racist incidents and cultures at this private school in Livingston, and to summarize the very complicated series of events of how the petition came to be. Basically, in June, I started a Twitter thread about racism at my former high school, including the behavior of some of the administrators. The thread quickly gained attention, but it was a tweet from a Black alum in the grade above me named Oluwadamilola, who had just graduated a year prior, who basically said, in case anyone wasn't sure, Newark Academy is racist. And that sent a signal to me of, hey, people, a white woman is saying Newark Academy is racist. Are you finally going to listen? So I continued tweeting, I continued sharing people's stories anonymously, other people shared their stories publicly. A fellow alumni actually created the Black at NA Instagram, and the movement gained traction among current students, alums, parents, teachers, and it ended up culminating in what became a 4-hour Zoom call with current students and alumni. In this Zoom call, I took notes, put together a suggestion of action items that we could really use at the school, and publish those action items on Medium. I'm gonna pull that up right now. I hope everyone can see that. So this was our call for change, and it was really just asking the school to acknowledge its racist past and commit to actionable items. And we made it really convenient for them. We split it into different categories of communications and meetings, and we made it easy. And so since this article was published, we actually had a protest at the school and some news coverage, and we were in Cosmopolitan. But this movement was pretty much driven entirely by Black women. My involvement has put me in the spotlight as a white person, but it was the labor of Black women and the activism of Black women that really brought this to the forefront of the school's attention. And the fact that it took a white woman tweeting about this for some of my own peers and family members and teachers who are also white to recognize it is something that really needs to be talked about. So that's why I'm here, and hopefully we can talk about more of that later today.
Thanks, Becca. And the final panelist, Mark Katz, although I will say something I've noticed in the chat, and people have already said this about how courageous this is, and I'll be honest, just my opinion, I don't think this is courageous at all. We're doing what we should be doing. So we're just trying to be human beings here. Anyway, Mark Katz. Mark is the founder of Next Level, a hip-hop diplomacy center at North Carolina. Yep, you heard me right, a hip-hop institute, one of the quintessential African-American art forms. But Mark, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, thank you very much for including me in this conversation. I do want to give a specific shout out to my friend Shakia Purple Hayes Norris, who works at NJPAC, for bringing me into this conversation. She not only works at NJPAC, but is an amazing rapper and artist. And she's doing incredible work with hip hop and youth. So look her up. And thank you, Purple. So I'm a professor of music. I've studied hip hop for 20 years. I've written 2 books on hip hop. And of course, as all you know, hip hop is rooted in African American culture, though it's quite diverse in the range of people that it includes. And really, that's why I'm here. I don't think I bring anything particularly special. It's really that I've had the privilege of spending years working with hip hop artists and traveling with them around the world through Next Level, which is a hip hop diplomacy program sponsored by the State Department, working with hip hop artists in this country and interviewing hundreds of artists, which has meant that I just spent a lot of time listening to people. And really, that's been the not so secret of all this, which is just listening to people and talking less. This is an opportunity for me to talk, but most of the time I think it's important for me to listen. So I can talk all day about my white privilege, but I thought I'd share a quick anecdote that illustrates a kind of privilege that I hadn't really thought about until recently. So recently I was nominated to run for an office in a professional organization I belong to. And at just about the same time, I was also asked to apply for a high-level administrative job at another university. I actually decided not to pursue either. And just for personal reasons, I just didn't feel like it. The result in both cases was that a Black person got the position. So, of course, they may have gotten the positions whether I applied or not, but it did make me wonder something. I wondered whether in the past, not whether, but how many times I've taken up space and power that a non-white person deserved to have. So I have no idea, actually, but I'm sure that it's happened. And that's one thing that's so insidious about structural racism and white privilege, that we don't even know sometimes when we are benefiting from it, when we are taking unfair advantage of it, even if we're not aware. So that's one thing I'd like people to think about, white people to think about, is how you can, it's about how you occupy space and how you occupy power. So progressive people often talk about reducing their carbon footprint. So I'd like my fellow white people to also think about reducing our power footprint. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mark. It's actually a good segue into our first question. Now, this question, there are going to be a couple of elements to this, so the panelists, you can jump on it as you see fit, but it's basically about why. I'll be honest, I've been asked numerous times, Richard, why do you do what you do? What do you care about this stuff? And it's not always an easy question to answer. So I'm putting it to you guys. Why do you do what you do? What is it? How do you see yourself in terms of the whole continuum of racial justice struggle in this country? What are some of you see yourself as an ally? Do you put a name to yourself? What are some of the impulses that drove you to become aware? Incidents or the way you were raised? Who knows? That got you to where you are right now in terms of this. And, kind of attendant to that is also the issue of white privilege. How have you seen yourself use or take advantage of that to advance the kind of work you're doing in terms of racial justice? I know that's a lot, but let's, who wants to jump in first here? Toby, go ahead.
First of all, I would like to acknowledge the name of my African-American mentor who worked with me for 17 years. And I met him during my very first job in New York. I was 23 years old. And the only thing that stopped our relationship on earth was his passing. And Betty Shabazz presided over his funeral at Medgar Evers College. His name was Charles E. Innes. And I dedicated a book to him, to his memory, and gave it to his widow, Marge. So he inspired me in my early career, early to mid-career. We had an authentic relationship. I could call him literally about anything. And there was one time, a very personal thing happened. I'd gone to a doctor. I was nervous about the result. And we had dinner together that night. And he noticed something about me. He said, "Toby, I know something's up with you. Spill it." And I said, "How did you know? How did you know?" But we had spent so much amazing time together and respected and loved each other very much. And may he rest in peace and in power. So I take a look at, in my work and in my writing, I take a look at penetrating white solidarity. So the banding together to protect white people's privilege and power. And in dismantling white solidarity, and really, as a white person saying, I refuse to be part of this, it's vital to form alliances with people of color in the organization and also white accomplices, where we can plan to eliminate and transform the majority white hiring practices and board nominations. When people of color are hired, there must be a focus on retention and making sure the organization and its members are welcoming, provide opportunities for growth and promotion, are uplifting, amplifying, elevating the voice of lived experience of the people hired and the communities that the hired people of color represent.
Thanks, Toby. Becca, do you want to chime in here?
Sure, yeah. So I am sorry to dismiss part of your question, but I think even the question of like, why do you do this? You know, what would you call yourself an ally? I think it's a little self-congratulatory to go on a spiel of like, why would a white person want to get involved? You get involved because you know it's the right thing to do. It's the bare minimum you should be doing as a white person. And like, I'm not going to just sit here and pat myself on the back for all the intrinsic, like you get involved because morally you know that you should. But I think that one of the things that you mentioned was, how do you use white privilege to advance your cause? And that's something that white people should be really thinking about a lot. I know I personally felt comfortable tweeting and criticizing my high school openly because I didn't feel like I'm going to lose job opportunities, or if I am going to lose job opportunities as a result of it, I have a network that I can fall back on and I'm willing to make that sacrifice. Or in interpersonal conversations where you can maybe give pushback to an administrator or someone who's a colleague professionally, when you know that if a person of color, especially a Black woman, decided to speak out on the same issue, there would be a much harsher retribution that she would face than what you would face. It is putting yourself in situations that might be slightly uncomfortable for you, or even more than slightly uncomfortable for you, where you have to give something up personally because you know you're able to do that, and at the end of the day be okay. And if you lose a job, you'll get a new one. If you lose a friend, that's okay, but use your positionality in a way that you have to make sacrifices, and that's kind of how you can use privilege to advance your cause.
Thanks, Becca. And the final panelist, Mark Katz, although I will say something I've noticed in the chat, and people have already said this about how courageous this is, and I'll be honest, just my opinion, I don't think this is courageous at all. We're doing what we should be doing. So we're just trying to be human beings here. Anyway, Mark Katz. Mark is the founder of Next Level, a hip-hop diplomacy center at North Carolina. Yep, you heard me right, a hip-hop institute, one of the quintessential African-American art forms. But Mark, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, thank you very much for including me in this conversation. I do want to give a specific shout out to my friend Shakia Purple Hayes Norris, who works at NJPAC, for bringing me into this conversation. She not only works at NJPAC, but is an amazing rapper and artist. And she's doing incredible work with hip hop and youth. So look her up. And thank you, Purple. So I'm a professor of music. I've studied hip hop for 20 years. I've written 2 books on hip hop. And of course, as all you know, hip hop is rooted in African American culture, though it's quite diverse in the range of people that it includes. And really, that's why I'm here. I don't think I bring anything particularly special. It's really that I've had the privilege of spending years working with hip hop artists and traveling with them around the world through Next Level, which is a hip hop diplomacy program sponsored by the State Department, working with hip hop artists in this country and interviewing hundreds of artists, which has meant that I just spent a lot of time listening to people. And really, that's been the not so secret of all this, which is just listening to people and talking less. This is an opportunity for me to talk, but most of the time I think it's important for me to listen. So I can talk all day about my white privilege, but I thought I'd share a quick anecdote that illustrates a kind of privilege that I hadn't really thought about until recently. So recently I was nominated to run for an office in a professional organization I belong to. And at just about the same time, I was also asked to apply for a high-level administrative job at another university. I actually decided not to pursue either. And just for personal reasons, I just didn't feel like it. The result in both cases was that a Black person got the position. So, of course, they may have gotten the positions whether I applied or not, but it did make me wonder something. I wondered whether in the past, not whether, but how many times I've taken up space and power that a non-white person deserved to have. So I have no idea, actually, but I'm sure that it's happened. And that's one thing that's so insidious about structural racism and white privilege, that we don't even know sometimes when we are benefiting from it, when we are taking unfair advantage of it, even if we're not aware. So that's one thing I'd like people to think about, white people to think about, is how you can, it's about how you occupy space and how you occupy power. So progressive people often talk about reducing their carbon footprint. So I'd like my fellow white people to also think about reducing our power footprint. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mark. It's actually a good segue into our first question. Now, this question, there are going to be a couple of elements to this, so panelists, you can jump on it as you see fit, but it's basically about why. I'll be honest, I've been asked numerous times, Richard, why do you do what you do? What do you care about this stuff? And it's not always an easy question to answer. So I'm putting it to you guys. Why do you do what you do? What is it? How do you see yourself in terms of the whole continuum of racial justice struggle in this country? What are some of you see yourself as an ally? Do you put a name to yourself? What are some of the impulses that drove you to become aware? Incidents or the way you were raised? Who knows? That got you to where you are right now in terms of this. And, kind of attendant to that is also the issue of white privilege. How have you seen yourself use or take advantage of that to advance the kind of work you're doing in terms of racial justice? I know that's a lot, but let's, who wants to jump in first here? Toby, go ahead.
First of all, I would like to acknowledge the name of my African-American mentor who worked with me for 17 years. And I met him during my very first job in New York. I was 23 years old. and the only thing that stopped our relationship on earth was his passing. And Betty Shabazz presided over his funeral at Medgar Evers College. His name was Charles E. Innes. And I dedicated a book to him, to his memory, and gave it to his widow, Marge. So he inspired me in my early career, early to mid-career. We had an authentic relationship. I could call him literally about anything. And there was one time, a very personal thing happened. I'd gone to a doctor. I was nervous about the result. And we had dinner together that night. And he noticed something about me. He said, "Toby, I know something's up with you. Spill it." And I said, "How did you know? How did you know?" But we had spent so much amazing time together and respected and loved each other very much. And may he rest in peace and in power. So I take a look at, in my work and in my writing, I take a look at penetrating white solidarity. So the banding together to protect white people's privilege and power. And in dismantling white solidarity, and really, as a white person saying, I refuse to be part of this, it's vital to form alliances with people of color in the organization and also white accomplices, where we can plan to eliminate and transform the majority white hiring practices and board nominations. When people of color are hired, there must be a focus on retention and making sure the organization and its members are welcoming, provide opportunities for growth and promotion, are uplifting, amplifying, elevating the voice of lived experience of the people hired and the communities that the hired people of color represent.
Thanks, Toby. Becca, do you want to chime in here?
Sure, yeah. So I am sorry to dismiss part of your question, but I think even the question of like, why do you do this? You know, what would you call yourself an ally? I think it's a little self-congratulatory to go on a spiel of like, why would a white person want to get involved? You get involved because you know it's the right thing to do. It's the bare minimum you should be doing as a white person. And like, I'm not going to just sit here and pat myself on the back for all the intrinsic, like you get involved because morally you know that you should. But I think that one of the things that you mentioned was, how do you use white privilege to advance your cause? And that's something that white people should be really thinking about a lot. I know I personally felt comfortable tweeting and criticizing my high school openly because I didn't feel like I'm going to lose job opportunities, or if I am going to lose job opportunities as a result of it, I have a network that I can fall back on and I'm willing to make that sacrifice. Or in interpersonal conversations where you can maybe give pushback to an administrator or someone who's a colleague professionally, when you know that if a person of color, especially a Black woman, decided to speak out on the same issue, there would be a much harsher retribution that she would face than what you would face. It is putting yourself in situations that might be slightly uncomfortable for you, or even more than slightly uncomfortable for you, where you have to give something up personally because you know you're able to do that, and at the end of the day be okay. And if you lose a job, you'll get a new one. If you lose a friend, that's okay, but use your positionality in a way that you have to make sacrifices, and that's kind of how you can use privilege to advance your cause.
Thanks, Becca. Mark, do you kind of walk the walk here in terms of what you're involved with and stepping away from your center? You want to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of the question we raised about your position in terms of racial justice, the whole white privilege, the use of white privilege aspect?
Sure. And I will say, I think ally is fine. It's shorthand for white people who are willing to listen. It doesn't mean we've arrived. It doesn't mean we're not racist. I don't use it for myself because it does feel, as Becca said, somewhat self-congratulatory, but also it makes it feel or seem that we've arrived, that we've finished our journey or process. And this is not something you finish. It's just something you continually do. Now, I'll mention two quick things. One is that you said I walk the walk. Well, I thought about this in terms of the space that I occupy. And I really took that to heart and put it on myself. What space am I occupying? And the one thing I did, and I'll just mention this one, was that I stepped away from my directorship of Next Level. And I did that intentionally and through a long process of cultivating others to take over. And it was a process that ended up with my stepping away and the whole organization being run by hip hop artists, run by the community that this organization is meant to serve. And it was the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to do for the organization. So I used my privilege to create something that sadly, probably people of color, Black people, Indigenous people cannot have done because of structural racism and prejudice. But once I kind of opened the door, I was able to step away. So that's one thing that I did, and I challenged myself to continue that. And one quick thing I'll just say is that we talk about why doing this is the right thing, but I also just want to mention that I gain so much from the work that I do. It's not just, I'm not just eating my vitamins, I'm eating my vegetables. My life is so much better for the time that I've spent in the communities that I've spent. So I also want to communicate to white people that this is not just the right thing, but we live in a very individualistic society where it's all about what's in it for me. Well, I do want to say that there's something in it for you. You'll be a better person.
Thanks, Mark. Well, speaking with white people then, here's a question that's been raised. How do you handle communicating with our fellow white people in terms of discussing issues of race, in terms of people who might you respond to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, the usual things like that. Anyone want to jump into that?
I will. Yes, so on Facebook, one of my Facebook friends said to my post was of the mural in Brooklyn, Black Lives Matter, in front of the Billie Holiday Theater. And it's magnificent. And one of my Facebook friends, I'm sorry to say, responded to that post with All Lives Matter, which, I mean, I had to get involved right away. And I said, by saying All Lives Matter, you're basically negating 400 years of destruction of Black lives. And this is something you must come to terms with, and white people need to be involved in transformative change, dismantling these structures that cause racism. And she still stuck with it. Well, I believe God taught me that all lives matter. And you always know there's a problem when God is brought into the situation, for good, for bad. Anyway, what happened is other Facebook friends from different backgrounds, white and black and other people of color, indigenous friends, all started saying, Black Lives Matter because Black Lives Matter. And don't negate this 400 years of history in which they have been they've been harmed and horribly treated.
Sorry, Becca, do you find yourself broaching the subject, raising the subject of race, of racial justice among family, friends, colleagues? Or are you more responding to the issue when it rises up? That's for both you and Mark, if you want to deal with that. But what's been your experience?
Yeah, so I definitely think that, being a college student at a liberal arts college and growing up among family and friends that are fairly left-leaning, I haven't heard the specific phrase, all lives matter, from people that I'm interacting with in person, but I've heard equally problematic things, if not more problematic things, and it's definitely a frustrating situation to be in when you hear something from either someone who's close to you or in a position of power over you or even a peer, and there's definitely that moment of, should I say something? And if you're even thinking, should I say something, the answer is probably yes. The question is just how to do so appropriately. So one of the things that I've learned about myself in these conversations, as I'm sure many of you have realized at this point, I tend to talk fast when I'm passionate or excited about something. So I need to recognize some things that are helpful, slowing yourself down in these conversations and asking questions. A phrase that I have found useful in, I would say, hundreds of conversations is when you hear a white person or another person of color say something racially problematic, a really easy response that's not going to offend anyone is, what do you mean by that? And then you start to get into a conversation of, well, were there racial underpinnings to those comments? If so, can we unpack that and have a give and take about maybe where those came from? But I mean, I have challenged friends before and lost friendships over it, and it's super upsetting when it happens. And it's not just people who are making overtly racist comments, it's also people who are saying things like, oh, well, we don't really need to discuss the death of George Floyd. I feel like we're on the same page about that. And it's like, you don't just get to say, oh, I'm not racist, we don't have to discuss what's happening in the news. It doesn't work like that. And I also have friends who I've lost friendships over their behavior in the pandemic, where I've said, hey, do you realize that by not social distancing and by going out and partying, your behavior is going to disproportionately affect Black and brown bodies? Can we talk about that? And sometimes people are like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. Yeah, we can talk about it. And other times people shut it down. And all you can do is try and provide information, ask questions, and further explore it. But I really think just the most useful thing to do is to get people to self-reflect. And a really easy way to get people to self-reflect is, what do you mean by that? Or can you explain why you said that?
Thanks, Becca. The Socratic method, rather than just calling people names, I guess. Although it is tempting sometimes to call people ignorant MFs when they really say dumb stuff. But this is a battle of hearts and minds we're trying to wage here. And if we can get people to some higher level of awareness, that's good. Mark, do you want to chime in on this issue?
Well, I want to echo what Becca just said about asking questions. It's a great way to find out where people stand. And I'm in academia. I'm surrounded by lots of smart people who I think are pretty careful about not saying outrageously racist things. So I don't hear all lives matter, or people just know not to say those things. But there are other more subtle and insidious things that I hear. So I spend a lot of time on search committees for job candidates or for graduate students, and I'll hear people say things like, we just want the best candidate, or we need someone who has gravitas. And I think of those things as examples of what I'd call sort of plausibly deniable racism or gaslighting racism, because I could say, well, that's racist, and say, what do you mean? Why is it racist just to want the best person? But the point is, it's code for the best type of person that I want, or we just want someone, we need someone with gravitas, meaning I want someone who is an older white man to take this position. So you do have to ask questions and say, well, what is your criteria for best? What do you mean by gravitas? Who can fulfill those criteria? And once you start to have unraveled that, people start to fumble a little bit and maybe see that it's harder to defend than they thought.
Thanks, Mark. In terms of dealing with current events, obviously, we're in a moment now where people seem to have, white people seem to have gained a higher level of awareness about police brutality, certainly, and then the broader issue of racial injustice, which obviously has been going on for 400 years in this country. It is part of the collective socialization, as DiAngelo points out in her book. But there's something about what happened with George Floyd that seems to have uncovered something broader, perhaps deeper. That remains to be seen, in my opinion, whether it's sustained. But I know that part of me, and I'll step out of the monitor just for a second, part of me, I guess maybe a self-righteous part, says to myself when I see all these protests about George Floyd, it's like, where the hell has everybody been? This has been going on for years. What do you all think, anyone can jump in here, what is different about George Floyd that suddenly has led to this huge amount of white people suddenly supporting racial justice, going out in the streets for it, chanting Black Lives Matter? What do you think that's about, shall we say? Anyone, Mark, Becca, Toby, want to start off with that?
I'll start.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Becca. Go ahead.
Becca, go ahead. Let's start with you.
Oh, no, I'm just ready to listen to everyone else first on this one.
All right. Then Toby, what do you think is different about this in terms of, more white people speaking out about racial justice?
Well, I'd like to speak how it affected me, and not speak for other people or make assumptions. So I'm gonna say that when I saw the video, the camera video, I felt that the officer had vile contempt for George Floyd. And he was intentionally, in my mind, using his knee to murder him. And for me, his eyes were staring at me as if to say, what are you going to do about it? And in that moment of murderous contempt for George Floyd and his life and his humanity, I just said, Black Lives Matter, and I have to get more involved than I've ever been in this. This just keeps happening. Black lives, people are dying, and I was outraged and thought for myself, I have to fight harder. I'm not doing enough at all as a white person. I'm not doing enough.
Thanks, Toby. I think you touched on something important. I've had these discussions, probably we all have. There's something, these kinds of incidents have happened for years. The murder of innocent Black people. There's been contempt, there's been brutality. Perhaps there's something a little more intimate about this one because you actually got to see for those 8 minutes that dead, vacant, reptilian look in that cop's eyes as he was killing Mr. Floyd. Maybe that was part of it, which generated a lot more visceral anger and enragement. But Mark, any ideas you might have about why And I noticed in the chat, some people said it's a tipping point. I reserve judgment on that myself yet, but Mark, you want to?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think there are promising signs, and like literally signs. As I walk around my neighborhood, I see all sorts of signs, from Black Lives Matter to, you know, more specific ones about remembering the names of people, Black people who've been murdered by police. So I think that helps, but it only goes so far, and we have to wait to see what actually happens. The question I want to know is, are people going to act differently? Are they going to, donate money? Are they going to keep their kids in public schools instead of putting them into private schools? Are they going to vote? Are they going to change the way they vote? So we don't know. I mean, this country elected a Black man as president. Many people said, great, we're done. And that hasn't happened. So I'm not dismissive at all. I think people really are seeing things differently. But as you say, Richard, we have to withhold judgment and see what happens.
Thanks, Mark. Becca, any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Why things are different now, if they're different now? Again,
Yeah.
you have a perspective that's a bit with the younger.
It is definitely a younger perspective. I think that there are several factors that come into play, and I'm not by any means a psychologist or a scholar of psychology, so this could just be my own theory. But I think that for white people, experiencing the COVID pandemic was the first time for many white people, and this is not every white person, but for the majority of America, it was the first time that white people experienced the government having a disregard for the safety and security of their bodies. And I think that feeling of, oh, maybe the government isn't really always protecting us as much as they should be, sort of created an opening mentally for white people to look at police as maybe not a system that's all about protection, but also maybe part of the problem. Because, I mean, yes, we were all home, and yes, we all had access to the footage of George Floyd's death, but that's not the first death that we've had access to the footage of. It's not the first death that I personally, as a 21-year-old, had witnessed on my Twitter feed. It's something that has happened for years, but I think that there's also a combination of educational resources being shared on social media at a rate that I've never seen before, where they break down issues and give you ways to understand things and talk about them, and people are open to hearing that because they're thinking like, okay, it's not this perfect country that we maybe thought it was or convinced ourselves it was. And I also think that the executive leadership in this country has brought an open air racism back in a way that white people had deceived themselves that, you know, oh, we have a Black man as president, or oh, slavery and Jim Crow laws are no longer in existence, so we think therefore that racism is no longer in existence. And I think that it was difficult for white people to see and recognize institutional racism for what it was, and also current day instances of just plain hatred and racism. But I think that, you know, the rise of the neo-Nazi movement and white supremacists in under Trump's presidency has also brought to the surface a recognition of themes of race and racism in this country that white people had kind of been able to convince themselves were not really as important as they are.
Thanks, Becca. I think there's no small irony in what you said, because, and there probably are a goodly group of white people who have suddenly come to that realization, which just reveals the kind of utter lack of historical knowledge so many people, period, and especially us white people have in terms of the history of this country. That this has been going on, and as someone in the chat pointed out, another Black guy was just shot, in front of his own kids in a van just yesterday, or was it today? You lose track of these things. You know, it really is outrageous. I'm curious as to what you all think about the role of understanding our history is in both informing your position as someone who, tries to deal with racial justice issues, tries to make it real in your own actions. How important has that been, or is it in terms of a broader engagement of people, certainly of white people in this, dealing with our own history? Anyone? Mark or Becca? I see your hand waving there.
If there are any parents, white parents in the chat, or parents raising white children in the chat, I would please say to you, your children are never too young to learn about racism and the history of race in this country and the institutions that have played a role in creating systems of oppression. Schools aren't going to teach it to them, and schools should. That's not at all making an excuse. Schools should be doing so much more. But if you are raised and socialized in a way that you're not aware of the history of racism in this country and how it functions through public schools and residential segregation and voting laws and like all of these things that influence every aspect of our life, then it's going to be that much harder for you as an adult to recognize, or even as a teen to recognize racism when it's happening, because racism is not just an event, it is systems and ways of life. And I think one of the things going to a private school that, was considered to be this great private school, very competitive to get into, we were constantly given this narrative of you're here because you are smarter than public school kids and you are more deserving than public school kids, and all of this stuff that completely ignored the fact that we were there because our parents could pay tuition for us to be there. And this school was actually one where it was built in before the Revolutionary War, and part of that building was funded by the sale of an enslaved person. And so you have to understand all of these institutional links that continue through today. And I think that one of the ways you can do that is just research literally any issue by Googling like racism and voting or racism and housing, and you'll find that all of these things connect to each other in so many ways that just when you talk about voting in your public school education, you miss it completely. And understanding how deep-rooted these systems are is so important for recognizing the ways that they infiltrate your life today.
Thanks, Becca. Toby, you want to chime in here?
Becca, you're so right about children. Children form their own opinions about their race and the races of other children as young as 3 years old. And so children are already separating themselves by race at 3. In terms of other action-oriented anti-racist actions, I have these to share. First, white people live an integrated life. Support BIPOC-led organizations. They're receiving very little money compared to overall philanthropy in this country. Only 4% of foundation money is given to BIPOC-led organizations. Expand your network and build authentic relationships with colleagues from a multiplicity of backgrounds. In organizations, center cultural and racial justice as a core value and implement it in every policy and every procedure, and hold yourself personally accountable and publicly accountable for racial justice and change. Build alliances with white accomplices to block white solidarity and supremacy. Make the effort to view everything through a lens of humility. And when you may have caused harm, admit it, confront it, check in, and repair and heal the relationship with a person of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. You kind of led us into they're not exactly closing statements, but they are sort of, and also ways of taking action we've heard a lot of it already from Mark and Becca. Thank you both. But do you want to add some other aspects to what you've been discussing in terms of how the actions that you've taken that you would suggest other white people think about taking who want to, put into action some kind of a commitment to racial justice and supporting that? Mark?
Sure. I think I'll expand a little bit on what I mean by sharing power, reducing your footprint of power or privilege. But I want to preface it by responding to a question, I think a really good question in the Q&A, which is, you're asking white people to give up stuff. What if we don't have much to give up? And I think it's a reasonable question that I want to address. And actually, I'm not asking people to quit their jobs. I'm not asking people to empty their bank accounts and give it all away. It's not about that. It's about being more thoughtful about the power that you have, about the space that you occupy. And I thought I would just share, if that's okay, this is my screen for a second, and just mention a couple of steps that I've tried to formulate for myself that might be useful for people to think about. So hopefully you can see this. So I call this how white people, and especially white men, we could talk about the gender aspect if we want, but can share power, or how to reduce your power footprint. So the first thing is just taking inventory. And for me, I realized that I was on all sorts of committees and boards that I really didn't need to be on. I wasn't contributing to, and I eventually quit some, but I'll get to that in a second. So first is taking inventory. What space are you taking up? What opportunities do you have? Be thoughtful about the opportunities you do take. I tend to do things because people ask nicely, but I realize in doing that, I've taken up way too much space and opportunities from others. So sometimes I just say no, and just doing that, it's not quitting something necessarily, it's just declining opportunities. Another thing is recommending others. I've developed a list of people that I can recommend for opportunities that come my way. And because I'm white, especially because I'm a white man, I'm tenured, I get all sorts of requests. And I could use that privilege by recommending others who don't have the privilege that I do. Another is to cultivate successors. So it doesn't mean quitting, but finding someone who's not like me, a white man, to replace myself. And then also providing continued support and mentoring. So not just saying, here, you do it, and leaving, but staying behind the scenes and providing continued support. So those are some things I'd like people to think about, and happy to say more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you, Mark. One of the, we have a bunch of questions, obviously. So if you all have seen questions you want to answer, chime up. But one of the questions here that was raised was, how often have you seen racism in an all-white setting? I assume whether it's family, what have you, and it has been challenged, or often is it just people just let it go by? I get the feeling that probably doesn't happen among you group, but why don't you speak up? Mark?
I'll just say, I hate to disappoint you. I have let things go, and because I'm a nice person, I don't like to create waves, and it's uncomfortable to say, wait, that was racist. So I'll just say, no one's perfect, and I don't want people to think that I or any of my, co-panelists think of ourselves as above the rest or as perfect in this. So I just want to say I've let things slide where I was like, I wish I had said something. So really it's, I have to step up. I have to just do what's right. But going back to something that Becca and I and maybe Toby talked about is asking questions. That's just a good way to have people confront their own racist statements. But I'm sure Becca and Toby have probably been better than I have about stepping up and getting in people's faces.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think probably all of us could probably say that at one time or another we let things slide. But Toby, any input on that?
I think for any white person, to say they, I always speak up, they're lying. I think silence, and some of the people in the audience have said, silence it's deadly, and silence is a form of racism. Absolutely. Because as Robin DiAngelo said, if we speak up, we're under a deal as white people of racial stress, and we can't even deal with one little bit of it, or we fall apart. We get so defensive and we deny it. That's what we do as white people. And so being conscious that we do that, having an awareness, having literacy about it, is the way we then say, we must step up. We cannot be quiet any longer. We have to be part of this change, or else more people will die. It's life and death.
Okay, thanks, Toby. Becca, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, when you ask how have you experienced or witnessed racism in all white spaces, I mean, being able to exist in an all white space, whether it's going for a walk down your neighborhood or being in a classroom or being in a group of your coworkers, like that in and of itself is an inherently racist thing, right? Why are there no people of color in that space in the first place? It's probably not just a coincidence. But let's say hypothetically it is a coincidence and that's not at play. The group dynamics of what are happening can be racist without someone saying something that is hateful or prejudiced or racist. For example, as a young person who goes to, or really not anymore, but as a young person who socialized in college and went to parties or other social functions, you start to notice patterns of, okay, my white female peers are very interested in socializing with young Black men, but not with young Black women. What does that speak to culturally? Why do we sexualize Black male bodies and we disregard Black female bodies? Like, let's talk about that. That's an instance of racism, but no one even has to say anything. It's kind of something that's just implied when, girls are making comments of, oh, these guys on the football team are really cute, but none of their friends are Black women. So there are a lot of things that go under the radar kind of, and you really need to start analyzing even why are you in the spaces that you're in, who else is there, and who else is missing. And that's kind of a way to unpack racism beyond just the specific instances of hate or inappropriate comments.
Thanks, Becca. There was a couple of questions raised again about the fact that it is just a white panel. And I know we had some discussion about this early on. Anybody want to weigh in on that in terms of why you felt, well, maybe perhaps hesitant in the beginning, ultimately, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but willing to sit on this panel, even though it was white people talking to white people? Mark, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll admit that when I was first invited to this, I didn't think it was going to be an all-white panel. And when I saw the poster and I looked at myself surrounded by other white faces, I kind of grimaced. I was like, oh, do I want to do this? Is this, I don't want to be, I'm not sure I want to be part of this. But we talked and, I think, we decided that we had something to say, but it was also listening, to Donna and Kitab, who we spent a lot of time talking with, saying, white people do need to step up, and we need to be the solution. this is a problem we created. So we have to be the ones to help, not just help solve it. We have to step up and solve it. So I think that's one way of defending it. But I'll still say I see these comments, and I just wonder whether I'll just leave it at that. That I don't know whether it's the best idea or not.
Toby, Becca?
Becca, please.
So I would love to screen share for a moment and actually share an article that Oluwadamilola, who's the woman that tweeted in response to my original tweet, first posted, and just point out that, like, I fully recognize I'm not at all the only perspective in this conversation. Black women at Newark Academy and at predominantly white institutions across the United States and across the world have experienced the things that I'm talking about today, and I am not at all proclaiming to have some unique narrative or knowledge here that they don't have. And I would also really encourage you to check out some of the other, I think all of the links are already in the webpage for this event, but I would encourage you to check out the work of the other women who have been involved in this. Their names are all listed, and I've linked everything where you can find that information. But the goal of this is not at all to serve as the end-all be-all say on racism and how white people should be dealing with it. I recognize that as a white person, like I don't always know the best thing to do. We all the panelists had a conversation over the past week of, is this okay that there are this many white people on a panel and we're lacking these other perspectives? The point of today is just to contribute what we can in a sense of, like, hey, maybe it will be easier for another white person to hear what I'm saying and say, oh, I think I could do that. And what I'm saying or what I'm doing is not at all perfect. I'm not purporting that it is. But I do think that the conversations that we're having tonight are conversations that should be having if you are going to dinner at an all-white dinner table, or if you are living in an apartment and you only have white roommates. Whatever your close core group is, if it's white, you need to be talking about these things in those spaces. The problems don't disappear when there are no people of color in the room. And so, we're trying to provide how we handle these issues, but everyone deals with them differently. I don't think I'm done learning. I don't think anyone else in this chat thinks that they're done learning. So we're not at all trying to have this be the final say.
Thanks, Becca. Toby.
The topic is white fragility. So I think it's important for white people to talk about what that means and how we all engage in it. We're all engaging in white fragility. And we all benefit from white privilege because of our skin color. And we all need to be allies and co-conspirators with other white people and people of color in order to transform our society. And there are many times every day when we can speak up. We can speak up, we can support, we can do everything we can so that our Black and brown brothers and sisters get opportunities that are given to us over them all the time. And I think it's important to have that conversation and get real about it.
Thanks, Toby. I have to know one of the comments in the chat, Tracy Williams, I think she's listening because she wanted to try to better understand white people. Good luck with that, Tracy. I think we are too, understand ourselves. But and as also another person I know, Linda McDonald, hey Linda, said this is a marathon, not a sprint. Indeed, it's a marathon of over a few hundred years, actually, isn't it? In terms of, and I'm trying to, you got to forgive me, everybody, if you see me looking somewhere. I'm looking at the questions and answers, the chats, trying to get as many questions as possible. So bear with that. But for our panelists, too, your relationships with people of color, Black people, Hispanic people, Latinx, etc., are there any, how do I put this, kinds of relationships, be they personal or professional, that have been particularly useful in making you aware and giving you ideas on how to position yourselves in this, in being a participant in the struggle for racial justice? It's a broad, maybe amorphous question, but somebody want to try to field that? Becca, yes.
I can try, and I mean, I think that it's a difficult balance to strike in your relationships, because as whether they're friendships or professional relationships or romantic relationships, you don't ever want to put a person of color in the position of mandated an unpaid educator of you as a white person. So I think there are so many things that I have learned from people of color that I share close relationships with, but one of the things that I'm always worried about is, like, I don't want to get on the phone with a friend and have a conversation about what's going on in the news and have them feel like they need to explain everything to me in that conversation, and that I can just show up without any knowledge and like kind of sit like, okay, like tell me what this means, what's going on. And so I definitely am not always entering those conversations with the right context or with the knowledge needed, but at least trying to inform yourselves so that you can be a better friend, partner, colleague to the people of color in your life is so important. And I mean, yes, I have learned a tremendous amount, whether it is about racism or just other things in life, cooking, you know, art, whatever it is, you gain a lot of value from different relationships, but you should not enter a relationship with a person of color under the expectation that they are your obligated educator, because I mean, that power dynamic is just, it's not appropriate.
Thanks, Becca. Toby, Mark?
I think that was one of the things we discussed as a group, as well as, again, what is this topic? What are the questions, as Becca would say? And it was important for us to deal with it as white people and not have the expectation that we would have Black, Indigenous, and people of color educating us within this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark?
I actually want to, if you don't mind, take a question that I've seen repeated a couple of times, and maybe Toby or Beck would like to respond to. It's about performative allyship or performative wokeness. And, you know, there are questions like, what is that? How do you know that that's not just what you're doing? And, you know, one thing I'll say is that we are performing. We are performing right now at this very second. We're performing allyship. We're performing sensitivity and thoughtfulness. So I can't get away from that label. So and from that reality, because what we do is performative. But what I would say is it can't just be performative, and our performances have to have a real impact and a real point. And there has to be some work that goes on behind the scenes where you are not getting acknowledged, where you are not getting a pat on the back, where you're not getting, you know, paid or shouted out on Facebook. So I'll say there is a certain amount of performance that goes on, but what I would say is if I try to list all the things and defend myself as not being performative, then I'm just being performative. So we just have to do the work.
Becca.
I just want to say shout out to Maria for asking that question. Maria was my co-intern in DC, and I saw her mention it in the chat before. I think someone else also asked it in the Q&A, but Maria, I see you. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I do think that, you know, there is not a definitive way to decipher whether someone's Instagram post that's trying to educate others comes from a genuine place or comes from a place of I'll get social clout if I'm posting about racial justice. I think that you are able to understand in yourself why you're posting something, I mean, that's a conversation you need to have internally. It's not necessarily something that someone can catch you in the act on, but there are also times when you can catch someone in the act on something. So if you're seeing people posting about, Black Lives Matter, and they're posting about, social distancing in the pandemic, but they haven't gone to a protest and they have gone to a party, it's pretty safe to assume that their behavior is virtue signaling in a way that isn't, productive. And I think there are a couple things you can do to that. You can talk to them and say, hey, I don't know if you considered this perspective, but you can also say, like, hey, I'm having a bit of a cognitive dissonance here because I'm seeing you talk about this and I'm seeing you choose to do this with your actions. Like, can we talk about that? It's just not adding up for me, and I'd love to hear your perspective, and giving whoever it is the opportunity to talk about it. But I will also call out my own high school, Newark Academy, which is absolutely a champion of virtue signaling and performative allyship, so much so that they decided to spray paint Black Lives Matter and make up t-shirts the day before the protest because they knew there would be news coverage, but didn't really implement the changes we asked for. They've already painted over the spray paint that they did and purchased the t-shirts from, a white-owned store that uses labor that's outsourced, and, it's a whole other issue. But performative allyship is something that happens if there are things that you can do to notice it in yourself that's productive. If you notice it in people close to you, it's productive to ask them to kind of explain why that mismatch is happening. But I would say, like, if your performative allyship is coming with actions, if you're taking concrete steps and you're saying, like, okay, maybe I don't fully understand this issue, but I think the right thing to do here is to sign this petition, or I think the right thing to do here is to call my elected official. Take those action steps if that's what other people are telling you is the right thing to do, because whether or not it's coming from an educated place or not, just like try and do something.
Thanks, Becca. There was an interesting question here about do we actually think, or from your experience, that white people listen to other white people when it comes to discussions over racial justice, racism, etc.? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, I'll just say briefly that I don't know. I think one thing I can say is that in terms of social media, when I see people post things, post articles that educate me or take stands, I listen and I see how other people model their behavior, and that affects me. So we can only speak from our own experience, but given that, I'm hopeful that people are open to both listening to other white people, but also following their lead and seeing how they model a certain way of allyship or just recognizing their own privilege.
Toby, Becca?
I just think it's important to think about this consciously, and what I find is there's a lot of white fragility. I mean, there's just a lot of defensiveness and denial, and yeah, I do that, and but there's no evidence. Then that is performative. Many of the letters that came out from arts organizations right after the murder of George Floyd were extremely performative, and they didn't outline what their action steps are, and they haven't even followed up, so you have no idea what they're doing. And then if you talk to people in those organizations, they absolutely admit that, they were performative. And so that's outrageous, because now during the pandemic, we should all be thinking about how we're going to become transformative organizations if we are primarily white organizations. There's no excuse. And that's why there are other letters that go out that say that are addressed to white arts managers and say, we see you. We see what you're doing. We know you're performative. And I think that's a good thing. We need to be called out as white people.
Thank you, Toby. There was also a question raised about what particular aspects of white privilege / supremacy have been particularly or especially troubling. I don't know if there is any particular one for the three panelists we have here. I mean, obviously none of us are black or brown in this society, which means we don't have the innate worry to have or the innate fears that black people have in terms of dealing with riding down the street, dealing with cops, etc. But are there any particular aspects of white supremacy, privilege, etc., what have you, that have been particularly challenging to you in terms of your upbringing, what you're doing now as an adult, your awareness? Becca, I saw your hand. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is white womanhood and the history of the white suburban woman and how much violence that has inflicted upon Black men, both historically and presently. I mean, we've seen numerous examples throughout the pandemic. And as I'm going about my life in different spaces, one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is like, what are the things that I'm doing that are invoking that history of violence and, that would present threats to Black people to this day, and also thinking about what's my role in a private higher ed institution. I plan on working in government after college. Like, what's my role participating there? I think that the biggest fear that white people should have is complacency and ignorance, because if you stop asking yourself, like, how does my role in this institution contribute to violence or oppression or inequity, you become so much more dangerous than if you're even just like consciously trying to figure out what can I do for harm mitigation. And also, like, in a lot of the spaces that I'm in, one of the questions I'm asking right now is how can I bring in more people of color, and how can I specifically bring in more Black women in these spaces that I'm noticing that they are really missing from. And I think those aren't questions that you solve overnight. It's not like you hire 2 people and you're done. It's more of a ongoing thing you need to be reminding yourself and asking yourself about. But I don't think that there's like any one big fear. And I think if you focus in on one specific fear, you're going to miss out on so many others that you should be paying attention to.
Anyone else? Mark, yes.
Well, I mean, there's so many different kinds of racism that we, that are operating in the world, from, just outright, murder to, more subtle kinds. I will say and maybe this is a privilege that I have, is that the people that I interact with are on the more subtle end of things. But I find that extremely difficult to address. I'll give an example. When I was director of an institute at UNC where I teach, I told the people above me a few years before I was to step down that I said, I do not want to be succeeded by another white man. There have only been white men in this position. And they didn't say that's crazy, you can't do that, or anything like that. They just said, that's a thoughtful thing to say, and we can't know, that how do we know if that can happen? So I really tried to make something happen, and I failed. I didn't have a say in who replaced me, but another white man was hired. And the thing is, I use the term plausibly deniable racism or gaslighting. No matter what I said, anyone could deny that they said a single racist thing. And that was so difficult. That's so difficult to do, because it actually makes me realize how much gaslighting Black people and people of color and Indigenous people face every day. If I get a little taste of it and it's driving me nuts, and frustrating me to no end. I can only imagine how it affects others.
Thanks, Mark. I guess for anyone with half an iota of moral clarity, it has to be enraging to see what, Black people go through every single day of their lives. But there have been a couple of comments here about, and this might be, we're coming down the home stretch, to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, where do we go from here? How is this not a one and done thing? As we said in the beginning, we're not experts. Nobody's an expert. No white person is an expert at what we're doing here. But it's a process. What would, and now for those people who are asking about reaching out to panelists, which I see people, Toby, you're giving out your email. Those people who know Kitab, Don, and myself, we can get you in touch with any of the people here easily enough. So where do we go from here? Panelists? That's a really big question, but do you have any, and this would be part of the closing thoughts for the discussion. Again, this is just a discussion and a conversation that needs to continue in one way or another for all of us. So where do we go? Toby, I see you're itching to.
So I feel a responsibility to live my legacy out loud for the rest of my life, with regard to living every day in the space of racial justice. And whatever I can do as an activist, as a scholar, as a friend, as a colleague, to inspire and support my white allies, friends, and for the privilege of having so many mentors of color, I appreciate so much. So I stand with my mentors, my friends of color in this fight.
Thanks, Toby. Becca?
I would say if you are not registered to vote, please vote and do so carefully and in a really informed way. And when I say really informed way, like I'm not just talking about Googling a candidate statement, but if you're hearing a politician that seems great for you and like you're all set to go, ask them specific questions about racial justice. I'm sure that someone in their campaign will be able to respond if you reach out, but you need to push for these issues and make sure that when you're voting for someone who you agree with their position on, taxes or whatever it is that's a specific issue, that you're not leaving out issues that affect other people's chance of survival, of physical survival. I saw in the chat, economic survival. I mean, that is so critical. And also to speak to that, if you're someone who's in a leadership position and you haven't already created an anonymous form for feedback, whether that's in person, through HR, whatever it is, do that now. And also, like, if you're in a position to hire people of color, if you're in a position to hire a diversity coordinator, because you have to recognize that your employees of color are not your diversity coordinators for free. It doesn't work like that. If you can create a position, if you can create a committee responsible for ensuring that issues are handled in your workplace, your team, your social club, whatever it is, do that now. I mean, there are so many things that you can do as a white person, even if it's literally Googling, what can I do to be anti-racist as a white person? But do something. Don't just read. Reading is great. Also take action. Action is tangible.
Thanks, Becca.
So, okay, I could respond. I echo both of, everything that's been said. Voting, being aware of voter suppression, and just really persevering despite the really egregious efforts to suppress the vote. But I would say on two ends, what I'm trying to do is, one is about really just using the power that I have to, for good. If you want to think of yourself in a self-congratulatory, super, powerful way, but I have access to funds, and I use the majority of it to hire people, to bring them into my classroom, always paying them, to find ways to use the funding I have to donate equipment. I use my personal money to donate, to support others. But I am in a privileged position where I can do that with, through the grants I have, through funding I have. But the other part of it is looking inward and always being aware of your own positionality, your own privilege, your own prejudice. I mean, on an everyday basis, every day I'm confronted with my own prejudices, and it's always kind of being in dialogue. Why did I make this assumption about this person? Why did I do this? Why did I think that when I saw this TV show? Any number of things. We all have that dialogue. We should have that dialogue with ourselves. So I say on both ends of the spectrum, out in public, providing opportunities for others, and then inwardly asking yourself, and on a daily basis, to reflect and how you could do better.
Thanks, Mark. To your point, this is immodest, but about 25 years ago, I wrote a poem, one of the lines of which was, "I feel your evil inside of me and I kill it at least once a day," which is directly related to how we are socialized and the whole idea of the implicit biases and racism that we absorb just by being white in this system. I would say that, and some of the chats have mentioned this, action is always the ultimate goal. I would say, though, that action has to be informed by careful analysis, particularly historical analysis. Malcolm X once said, "History is the subject best suited to reward our studies." I firmly believe in that. We have to study history carefully, truthful history, not the ginned up, revised versions we get from the supremacists in our country. But, and there's plenty of stuff to look at, whether it's Du Bois and onward, etc. So I just wanted to throw that in there also. Because we live in a profoundly ahistorical country, which is why so many things happen that people don't understand the issues of race and how complex and deep they are. So with that, I am going to send us, I think is back to Donna, I believe, who will close out on behalf of NJPAC.
Yes.
Is that right, Donna? Okay, Donna.
Absolutely.
And thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everybody who's watching, the chats, the Q&A. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything, but we tried. And so, Donna.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, panel, from the bottom of my heart. This was such an important conversation. It was honest, it was frank, and just amazing. And we could tell from the chat box how much people were really listening and how so many of you vocalized what people have been feeling. And so I'm very appreciative to NJPAC for giving the space to have this important conversation, and it won't be the last one. Our social justice programs continue every single month, and we choose different topics to speak about. Next month in September, we'll have 2 social justice programs. One is our Pearls of Wisdom, which will be on September 1st, and that's going to talk about the history of protests with Larry Hamm and Bill Payne. And then we're going to talk about the documentary Good Trouble, about the late Congressman John Lewis, and have a panel discussion on that, and that'll be on September 21st. So every month, you go to our website and please join us. And as Becca said, please register to vote and then vote. Please complete the census completely. And then, of course, visit our landing page, Standing in Solidarity on NJPAC's website, We thank you so much, all of you. This has been the most engaging participatory panel I think I've experienced, and it's been amazing. So thank you, panel. You all brought such richness and experience to this, and appreciate certainly the voice of our youth. Becca, rock star. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.